He didn't run for office, but the men who did ran to him. JP Morgan wasn't elected, yet men in power waited for his signal before they dared to act. Behind locked doors, he reshaped the fate of a nation. But what exactly did he trade to hold the country in his hands? This is the story of JP Morgan, how one man financed a nation and made sure no one forgot who owned it. John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut, into a world already mapped by money. His family belonged to an elite class of Protestant East Coast financiers with long ties to American banking. His grandfather, Joseph Morgan, helped found the Aetna Insurance Company, and his father, Junius Spencer Morgan, would later rise to international banking prominence in London. But it wasn't just their wealth that set them apart. It was their strategy. The Morgans didn't spend lavishly or chase headlines. They built power in silence through influence, patience, and carefully chosen partnerships. For young Pierpont, this was the world he was born to study and eventually inherit. From the very beginning, his life was not about chasing opportunity. It was about being trained to control it. Even as a child, Morgan faced physical limitations that shaped his worldview. He suffered from seizures and a chronic skin condition believed to be rosacea, which caused inflammation and discoloration across his face. The result was a boy often kept indoors, protected by tutors and surrounded by silence. That isolation sharpened his attention. He began to notice how adults spoke, how they chose their words, and what power looked like even when no one was talking. Morgan didn't dream like other boys, he calculated. His world wasn't ruled by fantasy. It was ruled by logic, control, and image. These early years taught him to listen more than speak. And in those silences, he found his voice. His father believed that America alone could not produce the kind of mind required to navigate the world's financial networks. So he sent young Pierpont to study abroad, where discipline was stricter and expectations higher. In Switzerland and later at the University of Göttingen in Germany, Morgan studied arithmetic, philosophy, and languages. He mastered French and German with ease, gaining access to circles and contracts that most American bankers would never see. More importantly, he learned how Europeans managed wealth, how old money preserved itself, how families avoided risk, and how trust could be engineered between strangers with just a handshake and a stare. Morgan wasn't just being educated, he was being forged into something precise. When he arrived in London at age 20, his father placed him at the heart of British banking. He joined the offices of George Peabody and Company, a respected merchant bank with deep connections to governments and aristocrats. There, Pierpont didn't just study ledgers and loans. He observed how capital moved without borders, how relationships were nurtured over decades, and how men gained power not by noise, but by presence. He was careful, quiet, and always watching. By the time he returned to the United States, he had already been taught that American business was loud and fast, but real power was cold and still. He brought home more than just a resume. He brought back a European understanding of control. Back in New York, he was no longer a student of finance. He was ready to begin engineering it. Junius Morgan arranged for him to work at Duncan Sherman and Company, the American partner of Peabody and Company. This placement wasn't accidental, it was tactical. Pierpont was being embedded in a network of international capital, and New York was the place where American dreams turned into empires. He stepped into his new role with the polish of a man twice his age, rarely smiling, always dressed in sharp-tailored suits, and speaking in clipped, calculated tones. He wasn't flamboyant, he was disciplined. And already, people around him were starting to understand. This man wasn't here to make money. He was here to shape the future of it. At Duncan, Sherman, and Company, Pierpont Morgan quickly proved he wasn't another heir looking to spend his father's money. He had an eye for numbers and a brutal sense of judgment. He didn't just evaluate a deal, he broke it down, line by line, until the risk was reduced to dust. Senior partners noticed how rarely he hesitated. While others debated, Morgan made decisions. In 1861, he found an opportunity that would mark his entrance into the national conversation: the purchase and resale of outdated military rifles. The deal was legal, but controversial: buying them cheap from the government, fixing them, and selling them back at a profit. Some called it clever, others called it war profiteering. But what everyone agreed on was this: Morgan had no interest in small talk. He was here to win. The Civil War was a turning point for the American economy. As industries boomed and railroads expanded, finance became more than just a business. It became a weapon. Morgan understood that faster than most. He positioned himself in the background, quietly funding rail lines, manufacturing ventures, and supply chains. He wasn't loud about it. But when money was needed and competitors flinched, Morgan stayed calm. His father remained in London, ensuring the family's European ties stayed intact. Pierpont, meanwhile, tightened his grip on the American side. Every deal was a lesson, every handshake was recorded. And by the end of the 1860s, Morgan was no longer just an apprentice. He was the partner everyone wanted, and the opponent no one trusted. When Duncan, Sherman collapsed in 1871, Pierpont saw an opening. Most young men would have panicked, but he didn't blink. He formed a new firm with Anthony Drexel, a respected banker from Philadelphia, and called it Drexel, Morgan and Company. This wasn't just a partnership, it was the beginning of an empire. Morgan set up operations in New York, while Drexel handled Philadelphia. Their clients were powerful, their deals were large, and their ambitions were bigger than anything Wall Street had seen. This new firm operated with the quiet force of a tide, pulling capital in and out of entire industries. Morgan was building not just a bank, but an institution that could command respect across oceans. As the American economy raced into the Gilded Age, Morgan's style became instantly recognizable. He wasn't a showman like Rockefeller, nor a populist like Carnegie. He didn't give interviews, he gave ultimatums. His glare, famously cold and unwavering, made even seasoned men break eye contact. Journalists tried to profile him, but often walked away with little more than a quote and a cold stare. His friends were few, his schedule rigid, and his preferences legendary. He adored art, hated inefficiency, and once threw a man out of his office for showing up late. People whispered about his power, but few understood it. What Morgan built in those years was more than wealth, it was control. At this stage in his life, Morgan's dominance was being felt far beyond finance. His decisions could move stocks, shift rail traffic, and alter the path of entire markets. And yet, he still preferred to operate behind closed doors. He rarely gave public speeches. Instead, he built a reputation where silence was more powerful than statements. Other men needed newspapers. Morgan needed only his name on the corner of a contract. His presence in a deal gave it credibility. His absence made investors nervous. He wasn't just rich, he was necessary. And by the mid-1870s, one thing was clear. If American capitalism had an operating system, Morgan was already writing the code. One of the most striking things about Pierpont Morgan was how little he relied on charm to get what he wanted. He didn't flatter, he didn't joke, and he didn't beg. Instead, he expected people to bend toward him. His office was more like a courtroom than a workplace. Quiet, serious, and governed by precision. He sat beneath dark oil paintings, behind a desk lined with perfectly aligned pens and folders. Visitors reported feeling judged before they even opened their mouths. Morgan understood something most people didn't. Power is more effective when it doesn't need to raise its voice. And in a world obsessed with noise, he turned silence into his sharpest tool. He believed in discipline to an almost religious degree. His routines never changed. He read the same papers each morning, took the same route to work, and demanded order from everyone who worked with him. There was no room for emotion, no tolerance for chaos. Even his family learned to adapt to his expectations. When he hosted meetings at home, his children were told not to make a sound. His staff communicated with glances and nods, knowing that a misplaced word could end a career. He didn't operate this way out of cruelty. For Morgan, control wasn't just a style, it was a necessity. In a world built on risk, he believed the only safeguard was structure. Despite his rigid exterior, Morgan was not without depth. He adored classical art and sculpture and built one of the greatest personal collections in American history. His walls held paintings by Gainsborough, Rembrandt, and Raphael. But he didn't collect for prestige. He saw art the same way he saw business: timeless, structured, and elevated. In rare moments, he would sit alone with a canvas for hours, tracing its strokes like a map. Art was his only escape from the constant demands of the market. It was the one place where beauty didn't need to be efficient. It just needed to exist. Morgan also believed in reputation above all else. In his mind, a man's word was a currency more powerful than gold. He once refused to back a deal that met every financial requirement, simply because the person behind it had lied in a previous meeting. To him, trust was the cornerstone of capital. If a man couldn't be trusted, no amount of profit could justify doing business with him. This ethic, though rare, became his signature, and it helped build a firm that investors would follow without question, because they knew if Morgan's name was on it, it was safe. By the end of the 1870s, Morgan was not just known, he was feared, not for cruelty or corruption, but because of what he represented. He didn't just manage money, he managed risk, reputation, and responsibility in a way few others could. He wasn't elected, but people trusted him more than they trusted Washington. He wasn't flashy, but when he walked into a room, men stood straighter. In the years to come, he would consolidate railroads, stabilize entire markets, and rescue the economy itself. But none of that would have been possible without this chapter of his life. This was the blueprint, the foundation, the calm before the empire. The American Civil War ended in 1865, but what came next wasn't peace. It was a race. Cities exploded in size. Tracks were laid faster than the eye could follow. From Pittsburgh to Chicago to Omaha, smoke, steel, and opportunity filled the air. The war had made industrial production a necessity, and peace turned it into profit. Steel mills worked around the clock. Foundries produced rail spikes by the ton. The appetite for growth was endless, and so were the fortunes waiting to be made. America wasn't just rebuilding, it was reinventing itself through industry. Farms became factories, and rivers turned into highways of steel. The railroad was no longer just a machine. It was a symbol of progress. Rail lines connected towns to cities, raw materials to markets, and imagination to infrastructure. The more rails a man owned, the more power he held, and every investor, from bankers to barons, wanted a piece of that iron web stretching from coast to coast. This new age had no playbook. Men with money moved fast, and regulations were nearly non-existent. Thousands of small rail companies emerged overnight. Some were legitimate, others were paper-thin schemes. Towns paid premiums just to be included on a map, and for each mile laid, fortunes shifted. But the system was flawed. Competition bred chaos. Efficiency gave way to ego. And beneath the glitter of progress, the cracks were already forming. The federal government, still recovering from the war, was slow to react. There was no agency to oversee industrial growth, no guardrails to keep markets steady. That left the door wide open for private men to step in, not just to invest, but to organize. The Gilded Age rewarded those who didn't wait for permission, the ones who shaped the game while others played it. And among them, one figure began to rise, not with noise, but with precision. J.P. Morgan didn't build factories. He didn't swing hammers or lay tracks. But what he understood better than anyone was the need for control. America had the tools, but it lacked order. Morgan saw the mess and smiled. Where others saw risk, he saw structure. And in that chaotic orchestra of expansion, he chose not to play an instrument, but to become the conductor. By the early 1870s, the railroad industry had grown into a monster, impressive in size, but erratic in behavior. Over 150,000 miles of track sprawled across the country, but much of it was built without planning, oversight, or cooperation. Competing companies laid tracks side by side. Others built routes to nowhere, hoping to get bought out before going bankrupt. And through it all, passengers and freight suffered constant delays, inconsistencies, and confusion. Rates changed without notice. Safety standards varied by region, and no two companies seemed to agree on how to operate. Investors were pouring millions into a machine that was rusting from the inside. Stockholders panicked. Towns fought each other for access. Lawsuits clogged courts, and newspapers published editorials warning that railroads might collapse under their own weight. What began as innovation was quickly becoming instability. The core issue was simple. There were too many hands on the wheel. Railroads were run by men chasing quick returns, not long-term strategy. CEOs undercut each other on rates, promised unrealistic delivery times, and sabotaged competitors with fake news and market manipulation. It was a house of cards built on ego, and when markets dipped, entire rail networks collapsed, dragging investors and local economies down with them. Trust was fading fast. American capitalism was learning that growth without discipline was dangerous. The country didn't need more railroads, it needed better ones. But no one seemed willing or able to lead that transformation. The government remained hesitant to intervene. Legislators debated antitrust laws but took little action. What the railroad industry needed was someone who could impose order without waiting for Congress. Someone who didn't just understand finance, but understood power. And then came Morgan. Not as a builder, but as a strategist. He didn't care about laying track. He cared about eliminating waste. He began studying railroad books like military generals study maps, looking for weaknesses, redundancies, and opportunities for consolidation. While others fought for market share, Morgan waited in the shadows, ready to reshape the battlefield entirely. Morgan's first major move into railroads came in the form of calculated aggression. He began purchasing large shares in the most unstable but potentially valuable lines. One of his first targets was the Erie Railroad, a company crippled by infighting and financial mismanagement. Morgan didn't just want a seat at the table, he wanted control of the board, and once inside, he pushed for mergers, balance sheets, and operational efficiency like a surgeon handling a scalpel. From Erie, he moved to the New York Central, a company once run by Cornelius Vanderbilt. Morgan understood that Central wasn't just a railroad. It was a corridor of influence stretching from New York to Chicago. By gaining control of it, Morgan placed himself at the heart of America's transportation economy. He began cleaning house, removing wasteful managers, enforcing standard schedules, and renegotiating debt. He didn't tolerate excuses. He demanded performance. Baltimore and Ohio followed, a line rich in legacy, but poor in leadership. Morgan applied the same formula: acquisition, reform, and domination. To some, he was saving these companies. To others, he was consolidating too much power. But shareholders didn't argue with results. Under Morgan's hand, railroads stopped bleeding money. Trains ran on time. Dividends returned. And slowly, confidence returned to a battered industry. He wasn't just picking random companies. He was designing a system. Morgan didn't want overlapping routes. He wanted efficiency. He pushed competitors to collaborate, and when they refused, he absorbed them. Every deal was strategic. Every share purchase was a move on a chessboard, and within a decade, he controlled the movement of goods across half the country. Not by force, but by structure. By the 1880s, Morgan had invested in and influenced over 20 major rail lines. His presence stabilized markets, frightened rivals, and calmed investors. The railroads weren't chaotic anymore. They were orderly, predictable, profitable. And behind that transformation stood a man with no interest in laying track, but every interest in owning where the track led. The business world coined a new term for what Morgan did to companies: Morganization. It wasn't just about buying firms, it was about fixing them. He identified bloat, fired unnecessary staff, and streamlined decision-making. Redundant jobs were eliminated. Duplicate rail lines were cut. Inefficient divisions were merged or closed entirely. What remained was lean, focused, and profitable. Morganization wasn't optional. When Morgan stepped in, he took full control. He didn't negotiate with weak management. He replaced them. He demanded uniform accounting systems, strict reporting schedules, and operational discipline. Each railroad under his grip began to resemble a military unit: organized, efficient, and obedient. The waste and confusion of the past were erased with ink and steel. His changes reached every corner of the companies. Scheduling was overhauled. Pricing was adjusted to stabilize markets. Maintenance became routine instead of reactive. Employees were told what to wear, where to be, and when to move. And those who resisted, they were replaced. Morgan wasn't interested in personality. He was interested in performance. This process made him powerful and unpopular. Labor unions despised him for mass layoffs. Competitors resented his influence. Journalists accused him of creating a new kind of monarchy, a financial throne with no crown, but all the control. Yet, even his enemies admitted, under Morgan, the trains ran smoother, the companies survived, and the economy, at least for a while, breathed easier. To Morgan, this wasn't tyranny, it was logic. He believed chaos was dangerous, not just for business, but for the nation. He didn't apologize for being firm. He believed in order, in systems, and in structure. And for the railroads, his doctrine worked. What others saw as corporate control, Morgan saw as the future. The real power of Morgan's influence wasn't just in boardrooms or on Wall Street. It was in his library. Behind the carved oak doors of his New York mansion, some of the most important business deals in American history were made. No press, no cameras, just thick cigars, strong coffee, and sharper minds. Morgan didn't need a courtroom. His parlor was enough. When the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central found themselves locked in a destructive rate war, they didn't go to Washington. They came to Morgan. He summoned executives from both sides to his home, instructed his staff to seal the doors, and refused to let anyone leave until they had an agreement. They argued, they resisted, and then they folded. Morgan dictated the terms and handed them a pen. This wasn't negotiation. It was arbitration with a backbone. Morgan understood that if the two companies continued to undercut each other, they would both collapse. He didn't plead. He didn't threaten. He simply laid out what would happen and how he could prevent it. And they listened. Because when Morgan spoke, markets moved. These meetings became legend. Men who had once called themselves kings of industry sat silently across from Morgan, waiting for his approval. They left those meetings with new contracts, new mergers, and new marching orders. But they also left with something more dangerous: a quiet acknowledgement that one man, unelected and untouchable, now held the power to guide the economy. His library became a symbol of backroom control, a place where egos were checked at the door. And Morgan? He never bragged about these sessions. He simply looked at the results and nodded, because to him, getting the deal was just the beginning. Making it last, that was the real victory. By the 1890s, newspapers had a new name for him: the Railroad Czar. It wasn't meant as a compliment, but it stuck. He was seen as a man with no crown, but plenty of kingdoms. With every merger, every rescue, and every boardroom shift, his influence grew. And the public began to wonder, had they traded political democracy for financial dictatorship? Political leaders treaded carefully around him. They needed his backing during downturns and feared his disapproval. Even presidents hesitated to criticize him openly. After all, Morgan could crash a market with a single decision. His name carried more than weight. It carried direction. And if he pulled out of a deal, it was a warning bell for everyone else. But Morgan didn't chase headlines. He rarely spoke publicly and avoided interviews. His power didn't come from the spotlight, it came from the shadows. From the phone calls, the unrecorded meetings, the quiet nods. He wasn't obsessed with fame. He was obsessed with efficiency, control, and the balance of the system he had reshaped. Critics continued to attack him. Editorial cartoons depicted him with octopus arms strangling the economy. Labor leaders condemned his layoffs. Populists accused him of monopolizing opportunity. But none of it slowed him down, because every time the markets trembled, even his enemies admitted they were glad he was there. Morgan had become more than a financier. He was now a stabilizing force in a nation addicted to volatility. Not elected, not appointed, but trusted by the men who moved money, and feared by the ones who thought they couldn't be moved. In the 1880s, America stood on the edge of a new kind of revolution, one powered not by steam or coal, but by electricity. Cities wanted light that didn't flicker or explode. Businesses wanted motors that didn't rely on belts or boilers, but there was no clear agreement on how to deliver this new power. On one side stood Thomas Edison, the brilliant inventor pushing for direct current DC. On the other, Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse, who championed alternating current AC. The nation didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a technical dispute, it was a corporate war. Edison believed in the safety and simplicity of DC power. It was stable, localized, and fit his vision of centralized generators supplying power to small regions. But AC had range. It could travel farther and be distributed more efficiently. Tesla's system, backed by Westinghouse, offered a future where electricity could reach across states. The science made sense. The business model did too. And that terrified Edison, who had already invested everything into making DC the national standard. As the rivalry deepened, the arguments turned ugly. Edison launched public campaigns to scare the public about AC's dangers. He arranged for public demonstrations where animals were electrocuted using AC, trying to brand it as deadly. His team even helped introduce the electric chair, using AC power to execute a prisoner, all to paint AC as lethal. Westinghouse and Tesla, frustrated but focused, pressed on. Their systems were more flexible, cheaper to install, and gaining popularity with engineers. While the public watched this battle unfold, Morgan watched something else. He wasn't distracted by press releases or protests. He studied infrastructure. He tracked which systems were scaling faster, which engineers were getting contracts, and which solution had long-term viability. Morgan didn't need to pick a favorite based on ideology. He would side with the model that worked, and the one he could control. And in this war of wires and egos, control was the ultimate prize. The War of the Currents wasn't just about science, it was about empire. Whoever won would control how the country lit its homes, powered its industries, and shaped its skyline. Edison may have been a genius and Tesla a visionary, but Morgan? He was the one who knew how to make vision into dominance. As the battle raged on, he started planning something bigger than either side could imagine. Morgan's first major entrance into the electrical world came through Edison himself. At the time, Edison Electric Company was expanding quickly, riding the momentum of the light bulb and the inventor's celebrity status. Morgan, always looking for the next cornerstone of industry, saw potential in Edison's work. He invested large sums into Edison Electric, offering stability, influence, and access to deeper capital. Edison welcomed the partnership, believing he'd found a banker who respected his work and would protect his vision. But Morgan wasn't in it for the romance of invention. He admired Edison's drive, but he kept his distance from the theatrics. As Edison focused on perfecting the phonograph and experimenting with motion pictures, Morgan watched the company's structure fall behind. Edison was brilliant in a lab, but scattered in the boardroom. Expenses ballooned. Operations grew messy. And while Edison remained stubbornly loyal to DC, Morgan began asking different questions. He noticed that more cities were leaning toward AC systems. He saw engineers quietly requesting Westinghouse equipment for long-distance power transmission. And he listened as utility directors explained how Edison's model was costly and inefficient in larger areas. Behind closed doors, Morgan began reaching out to rivals. He didn't threaten Edison. He didn't confront him. He simply made it clear that changes were coming, and Edison could either adapt or step aside. Eventually, Morgan forced a corporate restructuring. He merged Edison Electric with several other companies in the field, forming a new giant, General Electric. Edison opposed the move and resisted the changes, but he no longer had the leverage. Morgan pushed him out of day-to-day leadership, appointing executives who answered not to inventors, but to financiers. The company was no longer about Edison's legacy. It was about Morgan's future. For Edison, it was a bitter end. He had built the name. He had lit up city blocks and amazed the world. But in the world of business, that wasn't enough. Morgan had used his money to back a dream, and then used his power to take it over. It was quiet. It was clean. And for Morgan, it was exactly how things were supposed to go. In 1892, General Electric was born, not as an invention, but as a consolidation. Morgan pulled together Edison's company and several AC-based competitors into a single, sprawling entity. It was one of the first true American conglomerates, a machine built not in labs, but in boardrooms. With its formation, Morgan achieved something far more impactful than choosing a side in the current war. He absorbed both sides. He didn't just pick a winner, he bought the game. GE wasn't just a company. It was a new model for what American industry could be. Engineers, inventors, accountants, and marketers now worked under one roof, guided by unified goals and corporate structure. Morgan's people weren't interested in patents. They were interested in scale. They didn't ask if a product was new. They asked if it could be sold. And if it couldn't be sold, it didn't belong. Vision without results had no place in Morgan's version of progress. With GE, Morgan introduced a blueprint for how capital could control creativity. He turned innovation into inventory. He made sure that products went to market with speed, consistency, and strategic timing. Every division had oversight. Every manager had targets. No decision was made without layers of approval, and if someone disagreed, Morgan had one response: replace them. The results were staggering. Within 5 years, GE powered thousands of homes, ran electric motors in factories, and began designing systems for entire cities. Contracts poured in from governments, railroads, and private corporations. GE became the face of modern electricity, not because it had the best ideas, but because it had the best structure. And behind that structure, always watching, always measuring, was J.P. Morgan. General Electric became more than a company. It became a symbol of how one man could turn chaos into consistency and inspiration into empire. Morgan didn't walk factory floors. He didn't wire generators. But the decisions made in his office determined where America's lights would shine and who got paid when they did. As General Electric expanded, Morgan's leadership style hardened. He believed engineers should answer to capital, not the other way around. He respected innovation, but only when it served efficiency and profit. There was no room for vanity, and while inventors dreamed in blueprints, Morgan dreamed in systems. He wanted every gear, every socket, and every dollar to move in harmony. He installed financial officers in engineering departments, ensuring that all development costs were justified and reported. He required detailed progress updates, projected returns, and risk assessments before any new project was greenlit. Engineers who resisted found themselves sidelined. Creativity wasn't banned, but it was monitored. Morgan wanted results, clean, calculated, and measurable. Passion was fine, but structure came first. This environment bred a new kind of inventor, one who understood business just as well as circuits. Employees learned quickly that impressing Morgan meant delivering value, not vision. Boardrooms replaced workshops as the place where ideas lived or died. And in time, GE became known not just for its products, but for its discipline. It wasn't wild like Tesla's labs. It was ordered like a machine Morgan would trust. Outside this, observers called it corporate overreach. They said Morgan was squeezing the soul out of innovation. But inside the company, the mood was different. Projects moved fast. Resources were plentiful. And for the first time, inventors had the backing of a titan who could take their ideas global. If they followed the rules, it was a trade-off, and most were willing to make it. Morgan believed that without structure, brilliance was wasteful. He didn't want chaos in his empire. He wanted an army of builders, each guided by strategy. And in his world, the only genius worth keeping was the one who could follow orders. By the turn of the 20th century, General Electric had become a cornerstone of American infrastructure. Its technologies lit up major cities, powered factories, and transformed rural areas into modern communities. GE didn't just sell bulbs, it sold systems, complete electrical grids, custom fitted for towns, industries, and governments. Morgan's vision had worked. He didn't just own a business, he owned the current. GE was also pioneering in industrial research. It created one of the first corporate R&D labs in the world. Scientists worked under time schedules, producing incremental improvements in lighting, power generation, and materials. These labs didn't chase miracles, they chased results. Morgan believed in consistent progress over dramatic breakthroughs, and that approach kept GE ahead of its competitors year after year. Profits soared. Investors praised GE for its stability. Clients trusted it for its reliability, and countries abroad began importing GE's systems, turning the company into a global brand. Its turbines powered ships. Its transformers crossed continents. And every project reinforced Morgan's growing dominance, not just in the US, but worldwide. This wasn't just a company, it was a platform for empire. GE's expansion also triggered a cultural shift. Electricity was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. Households changed, industries evolved, time itself felt faster. Morgan didn't create electricity, but he gave it direction. He turned it from a wonder into a utility. And once the public depended on it, there was no going back. In boardrooms across the country, executives studied GE like a model. They copied its systems, its reporting methods, even its hiring practices. Morgan had built something far larger than a business. He had built a framework, and long after the light bulbs burned out, that framework remained. In the beginning, Morgan had simply funded progress. He backed inventors. He stabilized shaky companies. He saw himself as a steward of growth. But by the end of the 1890s, his role had changed. He was no longer just the financier behind industry. He had become the gatekeeper of it. Nothing scaled without his approval. And in the age of electricity, that meant nothing moved without his money. He wasn't content with shares anymore. He wanted seats, voting rights, executive decisions. He installed directors, restructured boards, and rewrote company charters. Morgan wasn't buying stock. He was buying control. His fingerprints were on every major industrial contract in the power sector, and rivals learned quickly. If Morgan didn't want your deal to go through, it probably wouldn't. His rise wasn't loud, it was steady, calculated, and ruthless. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he simply moved capital away from companies that resisted him, and toward those that cooperated. Resistance became too expensive. Cooperation became the default. And one by one, industries aligned with Morgan's expectations just to survive. People started to ask questions. Was this too much power for one man? What happened when democracy met corporate will? Journalists whispered about monopolies. Politicians hinted at regulation. But the truth was hard to ignore. Morgan had built a system that worked. It was fast, profitable, and dependable. And in a country still healing from war, recession, and volatility, that counted for something. Morgan had gone from banker to builder, from supporter to sovereign. And in the electric glow of his empire, America stepped into the 20th century, wired, humming, and running exactly on time. At the dawn of the 20th century, one name towered above all in steel: Andrew Carnegie. A Scottish immigrant turned industrialist, he had built a steel empire, brick by brick, mill by mill. His plants stretched across Pennsylvania and Ohio, fueled by innovation and driven by sheer will. Carnegie embraced technology faster than anyone in his field. He slashed costs, improved processes, and outpaced every rival in the business. His name didn't just mean wealth, it meant efficiency, toughness, and command. And for years, no one, not even Morgan, could move past him. Carnegie Steel wasn't just a company, it was a machine, a self-contained force producing more steel than entire countries. Carnegie owned the raw materials, the production lines, and the distribution routes. He paid close attention to every cost and every step. He wrote memos at dawn and read financials at night. His general managers feared him and admired him in equal measure. And while others played golf, Carnegie walked factory floors and corrected errors with his bare hands. Despite his strict nature, Carnegie was never driven by greed alone. He believed in responsibility, what he called the gospel of wealth. His philosophy held that the rich had a duty to give back, to shape society with their fortunes. But even as he planned libraries and universities, his steel mills pushed workers to the edge. Strikes flared, unions protested. Yet Carnegie kept the furnaces hot and the profits higher. He didn't flinch, not until someone offered him something bigger than pride. Carnegie had hinted for years that he might sell, under the right conditions. But few could meet his price. He wanted more than money. He wanted a clean exit, a legacy untouched by courtroom battles or newspaper scorn. He wanted someone who could take what he built and keep it whole. And he knew only one man had the money, the muscle, and the mind to do it. That man was J.P. Morgan. For Morgan, the moment was perfect. He had consolidated railroads. He had organized electricity. But steel was the foundation of everything. Whoever controlled it would control not just industry, but the very skeleton of American growth. And Morgan wasn't interested in competing with Carnegie. He wanted to buy him. Morgan never barged through front doors. He preferred side entrances, quiet, respectful, effective. He knew Carnegie wasn't the type to respond to flash, so he sent his trusted lieutenant, Charles Schwab, to begin the conversation. Schwab, already a key figure inside Carnegie Steel, had the confidence of both men. He understood the weight of what was being proposed. Over dinner, on a winter night in New York in 1900, Schwab presented the idea. Carnegie listened carefully. He was a man nearing retirement, in good health, and ready to shift his focus toward philanthropy. The business had grown beyond even his taste for control. His lieutenants bickered. His patience was thinning. He asked for $480 million, paid in gold-backed bonds, no negotiations. It was a massive sum, unthinkable to most. But Morgan didn't hesitate. To him, this wasn't just a transaction, it was history. Schwab returned to Morgan with Carnegie's terms. Morgan, after a short pause, simply said, "Done." There was no shouting, no need to haggle. Morgan had already seen the future he wanted, and this was the final piece. The handshake that followed sealed more than a sale. It transferred control of an empire, and neither man looked back. The deal itself was breathtaking in size. At $480 million, it would become the largest corporate buyout in American history at that time. Lawyers scrambled to draft paperwork. Teams worked around the clock to structure the terms, but Morgan stayed calm. He wasn't rattled by numbers. He had moved entire markets before breakfast. And now he was about to own the most important building block of the modern world. The press got wind of the deal days later. Headlines screamed, Wall Street buzzed. And behind the scenes, Morgan's rivals panicked. Carnegie's exit meant that the door was wide open for something new. something bigger than anything the country had ever seen. In March of 1901, Morgan announced the formation of United States Steel Corporation. It wasn't just a company, it was a juggernaut. With assets nearing $1.4 billion, it became the first corporation in the world to cross the billion-dollar threshold. Morgan had pulled together Carnegie's empire with dozens of smaller steel companies and iron mines. He didn't build them, he absorbed them. The company held more than 60% of the nation's steel production. Its rail lines, ore boats, and shipping routes stretched from Michigan to Alabama to New Jersey. It employed over 160,000 workers, and its balance sheet was cleaner than any railroad, bank, or factory system of the time. Morgan didn't care about the day-to-day operations. He cared that the machine was complete. To the public, the announcement felt like a thunderclap. Wall Street stood still. Europe took notice, and American businesses realized something had shifted. This wasn't about competition anymore. This was consolidation at a scale no one had imagined. And Morgan was at the center, calm as ever, holding the strings with steady hands. The structure of U.S. Steel was unlike anything before it. It wasn't just a company, it was a system. Divisions reported with military precision. Inventory was tracked in real time. Audits were routine, and shareholders received consistent dividends backed by a fortress of resources. It wasn't perfect, but it was powerful, and that's all Morgan needed it to be. He had created something untouchable, something too big to fail, too organized to collapse. And while Carnegie rode off into retirement with peace of mind, Morgan remained seated, scanning charts, planning expansions, and refining his new empire, one profit report at a time. Andrew Carnegie took the deal with grace. He accepted the bonds, smiled for the press, and returned to Scotland. He had what he wanted, a clean exit and enough wealth to spend a lifetime giving it away. Over the next 2 decades, he funded more than 2,500 libraries, built music halls, and supported universities across the country. He became a full-time philanthropist, and in many circles, he was celebrated as the face of noble wealth. But Morgan didn't care about libraries or medals. He cared about influence. With U.S. Steel now in his portfolio, he had cemented his dominance over not just a sector, but over the American economy itself. Steel made the tracks. Steel built the skyscrapers. Steel armored the Navy. Every time the country expanded or defended itself, Morgan's company stood at the foundation. Carnegie's departure was gentle. Morgan's arrival was firm. The two men couldn't have been more different. One warm and driven by cause, the other cold and driven by order. But in that moment, they were perfectly aligned. One needed release, the other demanded command, and the exchange was seamless. Morgan's victory didn't need a parade. It lived in spreadsheets, employment figures, and international headlines. He had proved what he always believed. Industry wasn't won in factories. It was won in meetings, in structure, in vision. And he had just raised the ceiling for what American business could look like. As Carnegie disappeared into history, Morgan stepped forward, not just as a banker or investor, but as the architect of the nation's most powerful corporation. He had bought the future, and he was already planning how to manage it. At its peak, U.S. Steel directly employed over 160,000 Americans. Indirectly, it supported millions more through construction, railroads, mining, and ports. 1 out of every 12 working Americans depended on the steel Morgan controlled. It wasn't just a corporation. It was an artery in the American economy, a machine that moved wages, mortgages, and entire cities. Morgan had never laid a beam. He never shoveled coal or smelted ore. But he understood something most businessmen didn't. He knew that the power of steel wasn't in its weight. It was in its reach. Every job it created, every train it carried, every building it framed tied back to his desk. He wasn't running a company, he was managing a country's growth. City skylines changed. Bridges were built. Ships grew larger. And Morgan's decisions echoed through every blueprint. His name wasn't on the rivets, but it was in the contracts. He wasn't visible, but he was present. Every time a crane rose above a city, every time a battleship slid into water, U.S. Steel had left its mark. And that mark belonged to Morgan. Despite his power, Morgan remained distant from his labor force. He didn't speak to unions, he didn't tour plants. He believed in hierarchy, finance at the top, operations below. But his reach was undeniable. From the smallest town to the largest port, his company's checks paid for food, clothing, and futures. U.S. Steel was the invisible hand in everyday life. To critics, this was dangerous. To admirers, it was genius. Either way, it was real. Morgan had created something that the government couldn't replicate. A system that delivered work, consistency, and growth without asking for applause. And that, to him, was more satisfying than fame. As U.S. Steel grew, so did the criticism. Editorials accused Morgan of controlling too much. Politicians whispered about antitrust violations. Labor leaders called him a tyrant in a tailored suit. And progressive voices warned that one man with this much power was a threat to democracy. But Morgan didn't flinch. He read the papers, closed them, and went back to work. He believed efficiency justified dominance. If smaller companies collapsed under his weight, it meant they weren't built to last. He didn't apologize for size. He saw it as proof of vision. In Morgan's mind, the economy wasn't a playground, it was a battlefield. And only the strongest, most disciplined systems should survive. Public opinion was noise, results were everything. Still, the attacks didn't stop. Cartoons painted him as an octopus strangling industries. Senators called for investigations. Writers warned of a new kind of royalty. One not born of bloodlines, but of balance sheets. But Morgan didn't answer the voters, he answered numbers. And as long as profits climbed and industries moved, his grip stayed firm. He viewed his role as a stabilizer. He didn't believe in chaos, he believed in order. And if that order required domination, so be it. He once told a reporter, "I don't care what the law says. If something must be done, it will be done." That wasn't arrogance, it was belief. A belief that systems, not slogans, saved economies. Morgan had stepped into a space where few dared to go. He didn't just move money, he moved history. And in the shadow of U.S. Steel, he proved that sometimes the man behind the desk controls more than just the numbers. He controls the direction of a nation. In October of 1907, Wall Street trembled. A failed attempt to corner the copper market by a group of investors had triggered widespread panic in the financial world. News spread fast. One bank was on the edge, then another, and soon confidence vanished almost overnight. There was no Federal Reserve, no mechanism to inject liquidity, and no safety net to catch the fall. Banks saw lines forming outside before they opened. Depositors rushed to withdraw money that no longer existed on hand. The streets of New York filled with fear, and the government stood paralyzed. President Theodore Roosevelt was away, vacationing in Mississippi, while his Treasury Secretary scrambled for answers. But there was no unified response, no national protocol, just panic, whispering from one institution to the next. Bankers were too stunned to act. Trust evaporated in real time. Newspapers warned of ruin. Store owners braced for looting. And as the financial heart of the country skipped beats, the public began to sense something even worse. No one seemed to be in control. Without a central authority, chaos moved unchecked. Some banks attempted to limit withdrawals. Others quietly closed their doors and hoped to avoid attention. Even healthy institutions felt the squeeze as fear outweighed fact. Credit vanished, loans froze, and in offices across the city, bankers stared at their ledgers, wondering how much longer they could stay solvent. One mistake, one rumor. That was all it took to bring a firm down. In the past, the government might have stepped in, but 1907 was different. There was no central bank. The Federal Treasury didn't have the structure or tools to coordinate a real response. It had influence, but no reach. Washington had outsourced financial stability to the private sector, and now it had no lifeline. The country wasn't just witnessing a market crash. It was staring into a vacuum of leadership, and in that vacuum, one man stood tall. Not because he was asked, not because he wanted fame, but because the country, knowingly or not, had built a system that relied on him when all else failed. J.P. Morgan didn't wait for a request. He saw the danger, and he moved. The first major institution to fall was the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest and most respected in New York. It had no formal ties to copper, but once the rumor spread, depositors ran. By the time its president resigned and the bank closed its doors, the message was clear. No one was safe. The collapse sent shockwaves across the country. Trust companies, unlike commercial banks, weren't as heavily regulated. They held immense power, but were more vulnerable to panic, and that weakness now showed. Within days, trust companies across New York began to hemorrhage cash. Some lost millions in deposits within hours. Lines wrapped around blocks. People fainted in the street. Police were called to keep order, but order had already slipped. One company's failure led to questions about the next, then the next. No one wanted to be last in line, and the dominoes fell faster than anyone expected. Business owners, unsure if they'd be paid, paused shipments and withheld salaries. Workers, unable to cash checks, skipped meals and canceled plans. The crisis wasn't confined to banks anymore. It was spilling into every part of the economy, and with each hour, it became harder to stop. Trust was the currency of banking, and in 1907, it had run out. The press did little to calm things. Headlines screamed of collapse and corruption. Cartoons portrayed banks as ticking bombs. Radio didn't exist yet, so the printed word ruled perception, and the printed word said disaster was coming. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and with no single voice guiding the public, fear became law. Even sound banks found themselves cornered by suspicion. Executives gathered behind closed doors, praying for a solution. But prayers didn't pay bills. They needed money. They needed strategy. They needed someone who could act without waiting for permission. And quietly, eyes turned toward one man with enough capital, confidence, and cold logic to turn this storm around. That man was already watching. J.P. Morgan's library wasn't built for emergencies. It was built for presence. Dark wood, marble floors, oil paintings, and silence thick enough to unsettle kings. But on the evening of October 23, 1907, it became the nation's unofficial central bank. Morgan summoned the heads of New York's major financial institutions to meet under his roof. Some were nervous, others were reluctant, all were desperate. They gathered in heavy coats and tight collars, surrounded by leather-bound books and dim chandeliers. Morgan didn't sit behind his desk. He stood, arms folded, and told them plainly, no one was leaving until a solution was reached. For the next 18 hours, he worked room by room, pair by pair, broker by broker. He reviewed balance sheets, asked blunt questions, and demanded honest answers. There were no niceties, only facts. At one point, several bankers attempted to leave. Morgan ordered the doors locked. They argued, but his stare ended the debate. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an order from the man whose name alone could stabilize markets. Food was brought in. Beds were not. Men dozed in chairs, argued in corners, and sweated under the weight of the moment. Meanwhile, Morgan calculated rescue figures in his head. He demanded contributions from solvent banks to support failing ones. He ordered liquidity to be spread across key institutions. He coordinated loans, forced mergers, and halted the panic, step by step. And he did it without a single government directive. His word was enough, his presence a guarantee. By dawn, they had a deal. Not just one, but several. Banks would support one another. Trust companies would be propped up, and Morgan's syndicate would stand behind the entire operation. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, and the library, for that night, had become the most powerful room in America. Once the deals were outlined, Morgan didn't celebrate. He double-checked the terms. Every detail had to be right. If one piece failed, the rest would unravel. He made sure that the strongest banks shouldered the heaviest burden. They didn't like it, but they understood the alternative. If the financial core collapsed, none of their empires would survive. Morgan spoke in simple terms. There was no time for politics. His rescue plan was bold. Nearly $25 million was pooled together from major banks. That money was injected directly into threatened institutions, restoring confidence in their solvency. Morgan's syndicate also backed commercial paper, ensuring that businesses could keep paying vendors, wages, and debts. Each dollar had to move with purpose. There was no space for panic anymore. It had to look like control had returned. Behind the scenes, Morgan pulled even harder. He reached out to newspapers and asked for calm headlines. He spoke with Treasury officials, urging them to match private efforts with federal support. He didn't need recognition. He needed alignment. And slowly, the tide began to shift. Depositors stopped lining up, banks reopened, and confidence, bruised but breathing, returned to Wall Street. The rescue plan expanded over the next week. More banks joined, more funds flowed, and Morgan's name became a symbol of security. He wasn't just rescuing companies, he was buying time. Time for the system to remember how to breathe. He demanded discipline in exchange, no waste, no speculation, no second chances. And those who refused, they were cut off. Morgan didn't plead, he didn't explain, he issued outcomes. Because to him, stability wasn't a debate, it was a requirement. And in 1907, he enforced it with an iron will dressed in a velvet glove. Even after the overnight meeting, the crisis wasn't over. A few days later, the panic threatened to hit the New York Stock Exchange directly. Panic selling resumed. The market looked ready to spiral again. Morgan stepped in personally. He instructed his team to purchase over $30 million in stocks, enough to halt the freefall. The market steadied. The collapse was paused. That same week, several smaller banks teetered on the edge of ruin. Morgan gathered their ledgers, analyzed their books, and made fast calls. He authorized buyouts. He merged weak institutions with stronger ones. In some cases, he replaced leadership entirely. He didn't ask permission, he just acted. Because waiting meant death for banks, businesses, and families. His decisions reached the insurance industry too. Morgan coordinated support for several major firms, ensuring policyholders didn't panic. He understood that fear wasn't rational, it was contagious. He moved quickly to contain it. When factories called in loans, Morgan's lines of credit kept them open. When investors hesitated, Morgan-backed firms issued new bonds. His name calmed rooms that were seconds from collapse. Wall Street slowly returned to life. Phones rang again. Deposits ticked upward. And in homes across the country, workers got paid on time. They never knew the man behind it. They didn't see the calculations, the backroom meetings, or the arguments that went through the night. But they felt the result, and that was enough. Morgan didn't gloat. He didn't hold press conferences. He went back to his office, reviewed his schedules, and planned his next moves. He didn't save the system for applause. He saved it because no one else would. And in doing so, he reminded the nation who really held the reins when the floor gave way. In the weeks that followed, Morgan was hailed as a national hero. Newspapers credited him with saving the economy. Politicians praised him cautiously. Even labor leaders, usually skeptical, admitted that things could have been far worse without him. But behind the gratitude, new questions formed. Should one man have that much power? Should unelected hands be allowed to steer the entire financial ship? The public marveled at his efficiency, but feared his reach. Was this stability, or something closer to dictatorship by wealth? Editorials began to wonder what would happen if Morgan ever used his power for the wrong reasons. Some called for reform, others called for a central bank. Even Morgan's allies knew the truth. This rescue exposed a gap in the nation's infrastructure. and they had leaned on one man to fill it. In Congress, murmurs turned into discussions. The Pujo Committee was formed to investigate concentration of power in the banking world. Morgan was called to testify. He sat quietly, answered questions, and defended his actions. He didn't apologize. He simply stated, "The first thing is character, before money or anything else." It was a statement, not a slogan, and it left the room uneasy. Wall Street returned to profit. But the nation's trust had changed. People realized how fragile the system really was, how close they had come to collapse, and how little say they had in the man who pulled them back from the edge. Morgan had proven that control could stabilize chaos, but he had also proven that too much control belonged to too few hands. The 1907 panic didn't just shake markets, it reshaped the American idea of balance. And while Morgan returned to his library, planning deals and scanning reports, the government began building something new, a federal solution. Because even a nation grateful for Morgan's rescue knew one truth. Next time, the burden couldn't fall on one man. By the early 1910s, America was beginning to change. The old guard of industrial titans, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, were still powerful, but their grip no longer felt unshakable. A new political wind was rising, one driven by reform, regulation, and public accountability. Journalists, known as muckrakers, published exposés accusing financiers of manipulating markets and crushing competition. And in headline after headline, one name kept reappearing: J.P. Morgan. He was no longer just the man who saved the economy. He had become a symbol of concentrated power. The term money trust became a rallying cry. It implied that a small group of bankers and financiers had hijacked American capitalism. They weren't just investing, they were controlling. Congress began to feel the pressure. Voters demanded answers. And beneath the surface, fear was turning into resistance. Politicians who had once quietly admired Morgan now questioned his influence. The Gilded Age had given way to the Progressive Era, and progressives didn't like kings, especially those without crowns. Morgan watched the shift with quiet disdain. He didn't believe in populist politics. He believed in systems that worked. But the world was no longer willing to tolerate closed-door control. The same public that once praised him for stabilizing the market now feared what else he might do if unchecked. Editorials warned of oligarchy. Unions demanded transparency. And younger business leaders began modeling new kinds of capitalism: flatter, more open, and publicly accountable. The stage was set for confrontation. Reformers weren't content with vague reforms. They wanted testimony, ledgers, and face-to-face answers. Morgan had spent decades avoiding the spotlight. Now he was being dragged into it. The man who once controlled entire industries without ever speaking to the press was now being called to answer for it, before Congress itself. And so, in 1912, at the age of 75, J.P. Morgan was summoned to Washington, D.C. to testify before the Pujo Committee. The country watched. The banks held their breath, and behind the wood-paneled doors of a packed hearing room, one of the most powerful men in the world took a seat under oath. The Pujo Committee hearings were unlike anything Morgan had faced before. For years, he operated in silence, behind mahogany doors, surrounded by men who understood his language. But Congress wasn't Wall Street. These were populists, reformers, and lawyers with a mission. The room was packed with journalists, and every word would be printed the next morning. Morgan wasn't used to being questioned, but on that day, he sat in a wooden chair and faced hours of scrutiny. Louis Brandeis, the committee's special counsel, led the charge. He was sharp, articulate, and unafraid. He pressed Morgan about his influence over railroad boards, his role in market stabilization, and whether he personally controlled too much of the country's wealth. Morgan didn't blink. He answered plainly, occasionally leaning in, his nose inflamed as always, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't rattled, but he wasn't indifferent either. This wasn't about a deal. This was about his legacy. Brandeis asked whether Morgan's bank selected directors for more than one company. The answer was yes. He asked whether those directors sometimes sat on the boards of competitors. Again, yes. The room stirred. But Morgan saw no issue. To him, cross-directorships ensured consistency. To the committee, it was a web of control. Morgan insisted he never acted against the public interest. But his definition of public interest wasn't what Congress wanted to hear. The hearing reached its most famous moment when Morgan, speaking slowly and deliberately, offered a phrase that would follow him long after death. "Money," he said, "is not made in banks. It is made in character." The room went still. For a brief second, even Brandeis hesitated. It was more than a quote. It was Morgan's creed. He believed trust came from judgment, not from charters or laws. And in that moment, the titan of finance sounded almost like a preacher. Still, the hearing concluded with mixed feelings. Morgan had held his ground, but the public appetite for reform only grew stronger. The Pujo Committee's final report confirmed what many feared. Too much financial power rested in too few hands. And even though Morgan wasn't charged with wrongdoing, the walls around his model of banking began to close. That single line, offered without drama or flourish, became his legacy. Money is not made in banks, it's made in character. For Morgan, it meant that trust couldn't be bought. It had to be earned through years of steady moral judgment. He believed men did business not because of regulations, but because of personal credibility. And in that belief, he found both his power and his blind spot. The world around him had changed. But Morgan still thought character could carry everything. The quote was printed in every major newspaper. Some praised it. Others mocked it. Critics said it was a defense of elitism, that Morgan's idea of character meant pedigree, connections, and wealth. Supporters argued that it showed integrity, that Morgan believed in the seriousness of his role. Either way, it revealed the depth of his conviction. He wasn't playing a part. He believed in his authority because he believed in his values. Inside his circle, Morgan was known for his sharp judgments. He could size up a man's credibility in minutes. He once refused to finance a railroad project because the promoter wore flashy jewelry. "No man with taste for diamonds should run a railway," he said. To Morgan, appearance, restraint, and discipline weren't preferences. They were qualifications. He trusted patterns, not promises. But in a world moving toward openness and regulatory oversight, that philosophy no longer felt sufficient. Young bankers no longer wanted to rely on handshakes. They wanted laws, transparency, and shared responsibility. The age of titans was ending, and Morgan's creed, while once revered, was now questioned. Character still mattered, but structure was beginning to matter more. The quote endured because it reflected a truth many respected and feared. Morgan didn't just lend money, he judged the worthiness of a man. And when he said yes, fortunes rose. When he said no, they crumbled. Money is made in character. It was his law. But laws, like empires, don't always survive the times. J.P. Morgan died on March 31st, 1913, in Rome. He had been traveling through Europe for his health, accompanied by family and staff. The news reached America before his body did. Flags were lowered. Markets paused. Newspapers ran long obituaries that read like the closing of a chapter. At 75, he had outlived most of his peers, but few expected him to leave so suddenly. For decades, he had been the immovable figure behind America's most critical financial choices. His funeral was attended by a select circle: bankers, diplomats, clergy, and friends. No parade, no monument, just quiet grief. Even President Wilson, no admirer of monopolies, sent condolences. Because whether you admired Morgan or feared him, you understood what his absence meant. A void had opened in the heart of the financial world, and there was no one alive who could fill it the same way. His passing came at a moment of historic transition. Just months later, the Federal Reserve Act would be signed into law, transforming the way America handled banking forever. Morgan didn't live to see it, but the timing couldn't be ignored. He had built a world based on individual power. The new world would be built on institutional oversight. His death marked more than the end of a man. It marked the end of a model. For those who worked under him, it was a personal loss. His employees described him as severe but fair. His partners said he never forgot details, never forgave waste, and never backed down from hard decisions. His office remained intact for months. No one wanted to sit in his chair, because that chair didn't just represent leadership. It represented a man who believed he was personally responsible for the economic heartbeat of a nation. Morgan's ghost lingered, not as a spirit, but as a question. Can a single man be the central pillar of a national economy? And if so, what happens when he's gone? Outside of finance, Morgan left behind another world, one filled with books, paintings, and rare manuscripts. His love of art wasn't for show. It was deep, studied, and sincere. He collected with precision, buying from European aristocrats and struggling dealers alike. His acquisitions included Rembrandt's, Raphael's, and Gutenberg Bibles. He believed that culture wasn't a luxury. It was a responsibility for the rich to preserve. The Morgan Library, founded in New York, was his gift to the public. He built it to house his vast collection, but he opened its doors to scholars and researchers. The building itself felt like a temple, quiet, serious, eternal. Inside were treasures that had outlived empires, curated by a man who understood the weight of history. He didn't name the institution after himself out of vanity. He did it to keep the collection whole. Philanthropy wasn't Morgan's public brand, but it was part of his life. He supported hospitals, schools, and churches. He funded the restoration of cathedrals in Europe and backed scientific explorations. Yet he never sought recognition for these acts. They were private expressions of duty. He believed in beauty, discipline, and order, not just in banking, but in the world itself. And he spent his money trying to preserve those things. His personal papers, preserved in the library, reveal a complex man. He loved his children deeply, but held them to impossible standards. He read voraciously, took notes constantly, and corrected mistakes without hesitation. To the world, he was stone-faced. To those close to him, he was quieter, but no less exacting. His love was measured but real. In the end, his cultural legacy softened his financial legend. He wasn't just a banker. He was a collector, a builder, a guardian of the past. And while U.S. Steel and GIs carried his power, it was the Morgan Library that carried his mind. Later that same year, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. It created a central banking system designed to prevent the kind of panic Morgan had been forced to fix in 1907. It was the government's answer to a question Morgan's life had posed for decades. What happens when one man holds too much financial power? The new system would regulate currency, stabilize interest rates, and provide emergency liquidity. It wasn't perfect, but it was institutional, and it meant America would never again rely on a single banker to rescue its economy. Morgan had once been the country's unofficial central bank. The Fed made that role official and public. Some saw it as a triumph of democracy. Others saw it as an admission of weakness. Either way, the baton had been passed. What Morgan did with backroom meetings, the Fed would now do with committees and policies. The era of private command had ended. The era of public coordination had begun. The Federal Reserve was more than policy. It was a pivot point. A national acknowledgement that no matter how brilliant, no one man should ever again hold that much influence. Congress didn't dismantle Morgan's empire, but they made sure it could never happen the same way again. His power had been earned, but it had also become a warning. Today, JP Morgan Chase stands as one of the largest banks in the world. His name lives on, not just in buildings, but in systems. But the institution now plays by rules Morgan never needed to follow. Rules he helped inspire through the force of his actions, the scale of his decisions, and the vacuum he left behind. He financed America, yes. But in doing so, he helped teach the country what it meant to outgrow its dependence on a single man. That may be the greatest legacy of all.